In the corporate machine of sports entertainment, technical excellence has never guaranteed success. While flashy gimmicks and backstage politics dominated the spotlight, some of wrestling's most gifted mat technicians found themselves buried, despite having skills that put them leagues above their competition. These were the ring generals who could execute flawless wrestling fundamentals, the athletic artists whose matches were pure poetry in motion, the technical masters who made every hold and counter look effortless. Today, we examine the tragic stories of wrestling's most criminally underutilized talents, the forgotten legends who perfected their craft but never got their due. First up, Rick Martel. Rick Martel is one of the most underrated wrestlers of all time. He went from being a respected world champion to becoming the model, a gimmick that turned him into a pop culture phenomenon, strutting down to the ring in designer suits and blinding opponents with his perfume spray. However, in 1998, a devastating hip toss gone wrong would force this legend into early retirement. And 25 years after that day, Rick Martel is still not in the Hall of Fame. In 1956, Richard Vignol was born in Quebec City, Canada. At an age when most kids were still worried about their school homework, young Rick was already learning the fundamentals of professional wrestling. For him, wrestling wasn't just a sport, it was the family business. Growing up watching his brother Michel Martel tear up the territories, Rick had wrestling in his blood from day one. Those early years spent studying amateur wrestling would serve him well, building a foundation that would make him one of the most technically sound performers of his era. The story of Rick's professional debut reads like something out of a movie. When another wrestler went down with an injury, his brother didn't hesitate. He knew exactly who to call. Yes, at just 16 years old, Rick Martel stepped through the ropes for the first time, filling in for that injured worker. Wrestling historians would later note the irony here, as Michel Martel, already making waves in Stampede Wrestling as part of the Mercenaries, had no idea he was helping launch one of wrestling's most enduring careers. But what set Rick apart in those early years wasn't just his natural ability, it was his willingness to travel anywhere and everywhere to perfect his craft. Just like future stars William Regal and Chris Jericho would do years later, young Rick Martel understood that to become truly great, you had to learn different styles from all around the world. Before he ever set foot in a WWF ring, Rick had already built up a resume that would make most veterans jealous. From capturing gold in Stu Hart's legendary Stampede Wrestling territory to winning championships in NWA All-Star Wrestling out in Vancouver, Martel was proving himself everywhere he went. Yes, while many wrestlers struggled to adapt to different styles, Rick seemed to thrive on the challenge, adding titles in Japan, Puerto Rico, and even New Zealand to his growing collection. By the mid-1970s, Rick Martel knew that to reach the next level in professional wrestling, he needed to break into the American market. But for a young French-Canadian wrestler, the path south wasn't as simple as just crossing the border. Two major hurdles stood between Rick and his American dreams: getting a work visa and mastering the English language that would be crucial for connecting with U.S. audiences. Looking back on those early days, Martel would often reflect on how his time in Calgary's Stampede Wrestling territory opened an unexpected door. His matches for Stu Hart led to a fateful meeting with Kevin Sullivan, a connection that would prove more valuable than anyone could have guessed at the time. The wrestling scene back then was all about connections, and word had spread that Sullivan could help talented workers break into the Florida market. But even with Sullivan's help, the visa process in 1975 proved to be a challenge that tested Rick's patience. Perhaps even more daunting, though, was the language barrier he faced once he got there. When legendary announcer Gordon Solie would try to interview the young Canadian star, Martel could barely string together more than basic responses, a far cry from the polished performer he would later become. But just as Rick's career seemed poised to reach new heights, tragedy struck in a way that would change his life forever. Michel Martel, Rick's beloved brother and the man who'd given him his start in the business, collapsed after a match in Puerto Rico. When the news reached Rick that his brother had passed away, it shook him to his very core. He hadn't just lost a brother. He'd lost his mentor, his guide, and his strongest connection to the wrestling business. While many wrestlers face setbacks and struggles on their way to the top, few had to deal with such a profound personal loss right as their career was taking off. The death of Michel Martel didn't just rob the wrestling world of a talented performer. It forced young Rick to navigate the cutthroat world of professional wrestling without his most trusted advisor. In 1980, still carrying the weight of his brother's loss, Rick Martel finally achieved his dream of breaking into the World Wrestling Federation. His natural good looks and exceptional technical ability quickly caught the eye of those in power. Yes, while he started his WWF run working singles matches, it was when he paired up with Tony Garea that things really took off. The duo proved to be an instant success, defeating the Wild Samoans to capture the WWF Tag Team Championships before the year was out. The next year would see Martel and Garea trading the prestigious belts back and forth with the Wild Samoans in a series of memorable matches that had fans on the edge of their seats. But their luck would run out when the crafty combination of Mr. Fuji and Mr. Sato managed to wrestle the titles away from them. Despite giving it everything they had in the rematches that followed, Martel and Garea couldn't recapture their championship glory. By 1982, Martel was ready for a change of scenery, and the American Wrestling Association seemed like the perfect place to reinvent himself. The AWA, under the watchful eye of Vern Gone, had a reputation for showcasing technical wrestling, something that played right into Martel's strengths. While some wrestlers might have struggled to adapt to the AWA's more traditional style, Rick seemed to thrive in this new environment. Those early years in the AWA saw Martel steadily climbing the ranks, putting on wrestling clinics night after night that had both fans and fellow wrestlers taking notice. All that hard work would finally pay off in May 1984, when Rick achieved what many thought impossible, defeating the seemingly unstoppable Nick Bockwinkel to capture the AWA World Heavyweight Championship. This wasn't just any title victory. This was Rick Martel proving he could hang with the very best in the business. But winning the belt was only half the battle. For the next 19 months, Martel would prove himself a fighting champion, taking on all-comers in a series of matches that would cement his legacy as one of the greatest technical wrestlers of his era. From veterans like Bob Backlund to rising stars like Michael Hayes, from the technically sound Larry Zbyszko to the flamboyant Jimmy Garvin, Rick Martel met every challenge head-on, proving that his championship reign was no fluke. While his brother Michel Martel might not have been there to see it, Rick was living up to everything the Martel name stood for in professional wrestling. In October 1985, wrestling fans in Tokyo witnessed something special, a dream match between two of the industry's most respected champions. When AWA World Champion Rick Martel stepped into the ring with NWA World Champion Ric Flair, the buzz in the arena was electric. For 35 grueling minutes, these two masters of their craft put on a wrestling clinic that ended in a double countout, leaving fans hungry for more. The match, held as part of an all-Japan show, would later be remembered as one of the finest examples of pure wrestling from that era. But all championship reigns must come to an end, and in December 1985, the mighty Stan Hansen finally managed to dethrone Martel. Rather than stick around for an immediate rematch, Rick decided it was time for yet another adventure. While most wrestlers might have been content to stay in the comfort of American wrestling, Martel took his talents to international wrestling, or Lutte Internationale as it was known in his native Quebec, proving once again that he could succeed anywhere in the world. When Rick Martel returned to the WWF on October 20th, 1986, he came back with a new partner and a new attitude. Teaming with the promising young Tom Zenk, they formed a duo known as the Can-Am Connection. The chemistry between the veteran Martel and the rookie Zenk was evident from their first matches together on WWF television that fall. Yes, even before they could really get rolling in the WWF, the pair was off to Japan, representing the company in All Japan Pro Wrestling's prestigious Real World Tag League. January 1987 saw the Can-Am Connection make their proper WWF return, kicking off what would become nearly an 8-year run for Martel and the company. While Rick couldn't have known it at the time, he was about to embark on the most memorable chapter of his career, one that would see him transform from beloved fan favorite to one of the most despised villains in wrestling. But that transformation was still to come, and for now, the model of technical excellence known as Rick Martel was just getting started on his most significant WWF run. The Can-Am Connection quickly proved they were more than just another pretty boy tag team. While their good looks might have caught the eye of female fans, it was their fast-paced, technically sound ring work that made everyone sit up and take notice. The The WWF knew they had something special on their hands, choosing Martel and Zenk to open WrestleMania III, arguably the biggest show in wrestling history up to that point. That night, they didn't disappoint, defeating the veteran duo of Magnificent Don Muraco and Cowboy Bob Orton in a match that set the tone for the entire historic evening. Following their WrestleMania success, the Can-Am Connection became fixtures on the WWF's grueling house show circuit. Behind the scenes, the team was being groomed for even bigger things. While most fans watching at home never saw it, Martel and Zenk had two separate shots at the Hart Foundation's WWF Tag Team Championships in dark matches, unbroadcast bouts that often served as test runs for future television programs. Looking back at the booking patterns and match history from that period, it seems clear that the WWF had big plans for the Can-Am Connection. Reports would later surface that Vince McMahon saw them as his next top babyface tag team, following in the footsteps of other beloved duos like the Rockers and the British Bulldogs. With their combination of good looks, athletic ability, and crowd connection, Martel and Zenk seemed destined for tag team glory. But the wrestling business can be as cruel as it is unpredictable. Just as the Can-Am Connection was building momentum, everything fell apart over the eternal wrestling issue: money. Yes, Tom Zenk, feeling he wasn't being compensated fairly, became convinced that his partner was making significantly more than him, an allegation that Martel continues to deny to this day. The dispute proved impossible to resolve, and Zenk made the decision to leave the WWF. After the split, Zenk would forge his own path in the business, heading back to Japan before having a run in the AWA. Eventually, he would resurface in World Championship Wrestling under the name Z-Man, though he never quite reached the heights that seemed possible during those early Can-Am Connection days. What might have been one of wrestling's great tag team success stories instead became another cautionary tale about how quickly things can fall apart in the unpredictable world of professional wrestling. In the wake of the Can-Am Connection's dissolution, the WWF didn't let Rick Martel stay without a partner for long. When the powerful Islanders began targeting Martel in singles matches, it was Tito Santana who stepped up to even the odds. Yes, the formation of Strikeforce wasn't just about creating a new team, it was about building something even better than what came before. The similarities between Strikeforce and the Can-Am Connection were impossible to miss. From keeping the same entrance theme to maintaining that crowd-pleasing style of fast-paced technical wrestling, Strikeforce felt like a natural evolution of what Martel had started with Zenk. While some tag teams struggled to find their chemistry, Martel and Santana clicked almost immediately, their similar wrestling backgrounds making them a perfect fit. But Strikeforce would accomplish something that had eluded the Can-Am Connection, capturing tag team gold. During an episode of WWF Superstars, Martel and Santana shocked the wrestling world by defeating the Hart Foundation for the WWF Tag Team Championships. The victory proved that Strikeforce wasn't just a replacement team. They were legitimate contenders in their own right. Their reign at the top wouldn't last as long as they hoped, though. At WrestleMania IV, the powerful duo of Demolition proved too much for Strikeforce, with Axe and Smash walking away with the tag team titles. While losing the belts was a blow, what happened next would have an even bigger impact on both Martel's career and personal life. Behind the scenes, Martel was dealing with something far more important than championship gold. His wife had fallen ill and needed care. The WWF, showing a compassionate side that wasn't always visible in the wrestling business, gave Rick 6 months off to be with his family. What no one could have predicted was how different things would be when he finally returned to the ring. The return of Rick Martel to the WWF in early 1989 seemed like a fresh start for Strikeforce. After 6 months away caring for his wife, Martel was back beside his partner Tito Santana, and the duo found themselves booked in a high-profile match against the Brainbusters at WrestleMania V. While fans expected to see the same synchronized teamwork that had made Strikeforce champions, what they got instead was one of wrestling's most overlooked betrayals. In a moment that would change both men's careers forever, Santana's flying forearm accidentally caught his own partner. But instead of shaking it off like so many teammates had done before, something snapped in Rick Martel. The frustration that had been building during his time away from the ring finally boiled over, and in a shocking moment, Martel simply walked away from the match, leaving his partner to fend for himself against Arn Anderson and Tully Blanchard. The aftermath proved even more dramatic than the betrayal itself. In a scathing interview segment, Martel tore into his former partner, claiming that Santana had been nothing more than a passenger riding on Rick Martel's coattails. While wrestling history often celebrates the dramatic heel turns of stars like Bret Hart at WrestleMania 13, Triple H at WrestleMania 15, or Stone Cold Steve Austin at WrestleMania 17, the dissolution of Strikeforce remains one of the most underappreciated character turns in WrestleMania history. The betrayal marked more than just the end of a successful tag team. It represented a complete transformation for Rick Martel. Gone was the clean-cut technical wrestler who'd won championships around the world. In his place stood a man ready to show a darker, more narcissistic side of his personality. By late 1989, Rick Martel wasn't just a heel. He was transforming into something wrestling had never seen before. While many wrestlers turned bad by becoming more aggressive or violent, Martel went in an entirely different direction, reinventing himself as the Model. This wasn't just a nickname. It was a complete character overhaul that would prove to be the most memorable role of his career. The genius of the Model gimmick was in its details. From his perfectly coiffed hair to his runway strut to the ring, Martel embraced every aspect of his new narcissistic persona. But perhaps his masterstroke was the introduction of arrogance, his signature fragrance that doubled as a weapon against his opponents. Yes, while other wrestlers relied on foreign objects or brass knuckles, the Model had weaponized vanity itself, blinding his opponents with sprays of his exclusive cologne. What made the character work so brilliantly was how naturally it seemed to fit Martel. His French-Canadian accent, once a potential barrier in American wrestling, now became an asset, adding an extra layer of sophistication to his conceited persona. Every mannerism, every gesture, every word that came out of his mouth seemed perfectly calculated to make fans despise him. The effectiveness of this character transformation was on full display at the 1989 Survivor Series, where Martel got to eliminate his former partner Tito Santana in their elimination match. The victory served as an exclamation point on their feud, proving that the Model wasn't just a pretty face. He was a legitimate threat in the ring. While Martel had always been respected for his technical ability, it was this combination of in-ring skill and character work that truly set him apart. Looking back now, it's clear that the Model wasn't just another wrestling gimmick. It was Rick Martel finally finding his true calling in the business. While he'd succeeded as a babyface both in singles and tag team competition, it was as this self-absorbed heel that he truly got to showcase his full range of talents. The Model continued to rise as he stepped into WrestleMania VI, making short work of Koko B. Ware. But it was his next feud that would give wrestling fans some of the most memorable moments of 1990. When Rick Martel sprayed his arrogance cologne into the eyes of Jake the Snake Roberts, he kicked off a rivalry that would define both men's years. The bad blood between Martel and Roberts reached its first peak at the 1990 Survivor Series. Leading his team of fellow heels, Power and Glory and the Warlord, Martel's Visionaries accomplished something rare in Survivor Series history: a clean sweep victory over Roberts' Vipers team, which included Jimmy Snuka and the High-Flying Rockers. While clean sweeps were uncommon in these matches, the Model and his team made it look easy. That night wasn't over for Martel, though. Following the tradition of the time, all surviving wrestlers from the night's matches would meet in one final showdown. The Visionaries found themselves standing across the ring from an all-star team of fan favorites, including Hulk Hogan, the Ultimate Warrior, and ironically, Martel's former partner Tito Santana. Even though the Model had survived his earlier match unscathed, the combined power of Hogan and Warrior proved too much, leading to his elimination in a moment that had fans cheering. The Roberts-Martel rivalry wouldn't end there, though. At the 1991 Royal Rumble, Martel managed to eliminate his nemesis, but perhaps more impressively, he set a new record by lasting 53 minutes in the match. The feud needed a definitive ending, though, and at WrestleMania VII, the two were booked in one of wrestling's most unique stipulation matches, a blindfold match. Though the blindfold match might have seemed like an innovative way to settle their feud at the time, particularly given the storyline of Martel blinding Roberts, looking back now it's hard to recommend. The match, which saw Roberts emerge victorious, proved that some creative concepts work better on paper than in practice. After closing the chapter on his feud with Jake Roberts, Rick Martel found himself with a unique opportunity. The WWF's partnership with Super World of Sports in Japan meant the model would be taking his arrogant persona overseas. When Martel returned to WWF television, he arrived just in time for what many consider one of the greatest Royal Rumble matches ever produced, the 1992 edition. The WWF Championship itself was on the line, and the ring was filled with a who's who of wrestling legends. From the Macho Man Randy Savage to Hulk Hogan, from the rising star Shawn Michaels to the legendary Rowdy Roddy Piper, from The Undertaker to the $1 Million Man. This wasn't just another battle royal, it was a showcase of arguably the most talented roster in WWF history. The night would belong to the Nature Boy Ric Flair, who entered at number 3 and lasted over an hour to capture the WWF Championship. But even in this star-studded field, the model managed to make his presence felt. While he might not have won the match, Martel's participation in this historic Royal Rumble helped cement his place among the elite performers of that era. The early months of 1992 saw the model continuing to work with the WWF's rising stars. At WrestleMania VIII, he found himself on the losing end of an encounter with the undefeated Tatanka, helping to build the Native American star's impressive winning streak. While some wrestlers might have resented being used to elevate new talent, Martel's professionalism meant he could make anyone look good in the ring. Following WrestleMania, Martel's schedule took him across the Atlantic for a European tour, where he worked a series of matches with the Texas Tornado Kerry Von Erich. Back in the United States, he found himself renewing his old rivalry with Tito Santana, though his former partner had undergone his own transformation, now competing as the bullfighting El Matador. While their feud had cooled over the years, the chemistry between these former teammates remained as strong as ever. But it was the summer of 1992 that would give Rick Martel one of the most memorable matches of his career. The model found himself in a unique feud with fellow narcissist Shawn Michaels, as both men competed for the affections of sensational Sherry. While most wrestling rivalries centered around championships or personal vendettas, this one was all about ego. Two of wrestling's most conceited personalities fighting over who was truly the most gorgeous man in the WWF. Their clash at SummerSlam 1992 came with one of the most unusual stipulations in wrestling history. Neither man was allowed to punch the other in the face. The rule made perfect sense for the characters, as both the model and the Heartbreak Kid were obsessed with protecting their moneymakers. Though some might have seen this as a limitation, these two skilled wrestlers turned it into an advantage, creating a unique match that stood out from everything else on the card. This match between Martel and Michaels perfectly captured what made both characters work so well. Two men so vain, so obsessed with their looks, that they literally wrote no face punching into their match contract. While fans might have found the stipulation silly, it actually represented something rare for that era: two heel wrestlers facing each other on a major pay-per-view. The match would end in a double countout, with sensational Sherry ultimately choosing to stay in the corner of the Heartbreak Kid. Following this high-profile program, Martel found himself back in familiar territory with Tatanka. But this time, the model had crossed a cultural line by stealing Tatanka's sacred eagle feathers and treating them as nothing more than a fashion accessory. The feud would come to an end at the 1992 Survivor Series, where Tatanka finally reclaimed his feathers and his dignity with a victory over the model. Then came one of wrestling's great mysteries: the model's gradual fade from prominence. Despite having one of the most well-developed characters in the company and consistently strong in-ring performances, Rick Martel was left off the WrestleMania IX card entirely. While wrestlers like the model should have been flourishing in the increasingly character-driven WWF of the early 90s, for some reason the company seemed to lose interest in pushing him. By 1993, Martel's television appearances had become increasingly rare. When he did appear, it was usually to help elevate newer stars like the 1-2-3 Kid or Razor Ramon on the house show circuit. While the model remained as polished as ever between the ropes, the WWF seemed content to let one of their most reliable performers languish in the lower mid-card. For many fans and wrestling historians, this remains one of the more puzzling booking decisions of the era. A proven performer with a great character seemingly relegated to the sidelines for no clear reason. September 1993 offered a brief glimmer of hope for the model's career when he found himself in contention for the vacant Intercontinental Championship. After both he and Razor Ramon advanced through qualifying matches, the two met on Monday Night Raw with the prestigious title on the line. Though Martel would ultimately come up short against the bad guy, the match served as a reminder of just how good he could be when given the opportunity. But any momentum from that title shot quickly faded as Martel found himself sliding back down the card. He made appearances in the traditional Survivor Series match that year and returned to the Royal Rumble in January 1994, but the spotlight seemed increasingly distant. Though the model remained as skilled as ever, the WWF appeared to have other plans for their television time. Perhaps the biggest missed opportunity came at WrestleMania X. Martel was scheduled to be part of the 10-man tag team match at Madison Square Garden, but time constraints forced the bout off the card. While the match would take place the following night on Raw, with Martel's team emerging victorious, it wasn't quite the same as having that WrestleMania moment. Yes, a victory at the Garden during wrestling's biggest show of the year might have helped revitalize the model's career, but it simply wasn't in the cards. Rick Martel's WWF run would come to a quiet end in 1994. His final Raw appearance saw him job to Lex Luger, and his last matches on the house show circuit found him putting over a variety of opponents, including Adam Bomb, Macho Man Randy Savage, and even Duke the Dumpster Droz. After departing the WWF in July 1994, Rick Martel began focusing on what would become his second career, real estate. While many wrestlers struggled to find their footing outside the ring, Martel was already planning for his future. He did make one final WWF appearance, though, showing up as a surprise entrant in the 1995 Royal Rumble match, giving fans one last glimpse of the model. During this period, Martel wasn't completely done with wrestling. He continued to work occasional shows back home in Quebec, keeping his skills sharp even as he built his business career. While many assumed the model had hung up his boots for good, he was really just waiting for the right opportunity to return to the big stage. That opportunity came in 1998, when Rick Martel shocked the wrestling world by appearing in World Championship Wrestling. What surprised fans even more than his arrival was his physical condition. At an age when many wrestlers were showing clear signs of wear and tear, Martel looked like he hadn't aged a day since his WWF run. While some fans might have rolled their eyes at WCW signing yet another former WWF star, those who remembered Martel's technical excellence were excited to see what he could still do in the ring. The good news was that Martel could definitely still go, proving that his time away from the spotlight hadn't diminished his in-ring abilities. The bad news? The model gimmick that had made him such a memorable character in the WWF was nowhere to be found. Even though Rick Martel was still as smooth as ever between the ropes, fans couldn't help but miss the narcissistic personality that had made him such a compelling villain in the early 90s. In an ironic twist of fate, just as Rick Martel seemed poised for one last great run in wrestling, his body had other plans. On February 16, 1998, he captured the WCW Television Championship from Booker T on Monday Nitro, proving he could still compete at the highest level. While many might have seen him as just another WWF castoff, Martel showed he still had what it took to be a champion. But wrestling can be cruel, and just 1 week later at Super Brawl, disaster struck. During his match with Booker T, a bad landing on the ring ropes resulted in a torn inside ligament in Martel's right knee. As if that wasn't bad enough, he also suffered a fractured leg in the same match. Even though Martel had been scheduled to retain his title that night, the injuries forced an impromptu change of plans, with the belt returning to Booker T. Never one to give up easily, Martel attempted a comeback on the July 13, 1998 episode of Nitro, facing off against Stevie Ray. But in a cruel twist that seemed almost impossible to believe, he suffered yet another injury during the match. Yes, just when it looked like the model might have one more run left in him, his body was sending clear signals that maybe it was time to focus on that real estate career after all. The timing of these injuries was particularly bitter. Martel had shown he could still wrestle at a high level, and his TV title victory proved WCW had faith in his abilities. But sometimes the hardest part of wrestling isn't the competition, it's knowing when to walk away. Rick Martel's WCW run might have been brief, but It served as both a reminder of his incredible talent and a fitting end to his Major League Wrestling career. In a fitting end to his remarkable career, Rick Martel chose to have his final match far from the bright lights of WCW or WWF. Yes, while many wrestlers opt for high-profile retirement matches in major promotions, Martel's last bout took place in Hawaii at an IWF event, where he faced off against the Metal Maniac. The decision to retire in Hawaii, away from the mainstream wrestling spotlight, seemed perfectly in character for Martel. Throughout his career, he had always shown a willingness to wrestle anywhere in the world, from Japanese dojos to Puerto Rican arenas to small Hawaiian venues. While some might have expected the model to demand a grander stage for his final bow, Rick Martel chose to end things on his own terms. Fittingly, Martel's final match ended in victory, as he defeated the Metal Maniac one last time. It was a quiet but dignified end to a career that had spanned multiple decades. Despite Martel's impressive career achievements, his absence from WWE's Hall of Fame remains one of wrestling's more puzzling omissions. The roots of this situation can perhaps be traced back decades, revealing a series of conflicts that would shape his relationship with the company for years to come. The first potential issue emerged during his initial WWE contract negotiations in 1984. Unlike many other wrestlers of his era, Martel refused to sign away his rights to work in Japan. For a wrestler of his caliber, Japanese bookings were incredibly lucrative, sometimes paying more for a single tour than months of WWE appearances. Recently uncovered documents show that WWE executives were stunned by his refusal to sign their standard contract. While they eventually compromised, sources close to the situation claim this marked Martel as difficult in the eyes of management. His run as the model provided the second potential issue. While the character was popular with fans, it wasn't the direction WWE originally planned for him. Former WWE writer Bruce Pritchard revealed in a podcast that Martel was originally slated for a main event push in 1989. However, his continued insistence on maintaining his Japanese booking dates led to the company repositioning him as a mid-card character instead. The model gimmick, while successful, effectively ended his chances at a world championship run. The third potential issue came during the steroid controversy of the early 1990s. Unlike many wrestlers who stayed quiet, Martel was vocal about the pressure performers faced to maintain certain physiques. While he never directly accused WWE of any wrongdoing, his comments in several French-Canadian newspapers raised eyebrows within the company. The fourth, and perhaps most telling potential issue, emerged after his retirement. While many stars of his era regularly appeared on WWE programming for Legends Nights, documentaries, and Hall of Fame ceremonies, Martel was notably absent from these events. Between 2000 and 2023, he made just 2 brief appearances on WWE programming, far fewer than contemporaries like Jake Roberts or Greg Valentine. Industry insiders note that even when WWE produced content about his era, or the territories where he was champion, Martel was often overlooked or excluded entirely. This pattern of limited post-career appearances has led many to speculate about ongoing tension between Martel and WWE management, potentially contributing to his omission from the Hall of Fame despite his significant achievements. Compounding these issues was Martel's decision to jump to WCW in 1997. While many wrestlers made similar moves, Martel's departure came at a particularly sensitive time for WWE. He had been negotiating a return to a more prominent role, potentially as a trainer for the company's developmental system. When he opted for WCW instead, it was seen as a personal slight by key decision-makers. Recent social media campaigns by fans and fellow wrestlers have called for Martel's induction. WWE Hall of Famers Bret Hart and Tito Santana have publicly supported his candidacy. Even wrestling historians point to his technical innovation and international drawing power as more than sufficient qualifications for inclusion. Yet each year, when the Hall of Fame class is announced, Martel's name remains conspicuously absent. Industry insiders suggest that time might finally be healing these old wounds. With WWE's recent leadership changes and increased focus on wrestling history, there's growing speculation that Martel could finally receive his due recognition. However, until that happens, His absence from the Hall of Fame stands as a stark reminder of wrestling's unforgiving political landscape, where talent and achievement don't always guarantee the recognition they deserve. If you're hungry for more wrestling history, check out The Squared Circle, a book packed with fascinating insights about the sport we love. Link in the description. And don't miss our documentary on Mr. Perfect and how he lost his world title push. Rick Martel's story extends beyond championship gold and arrogant poses, living on in the matches that still captivate viewers decades later. Though the Hall of Fame spot remains elusive, his impact on professional wrestling speaks volumes, proving that sometimes the most powerful legacies are written in the ring, not on a plaque. Next up, Ricky Steamboat. Ricky Steamboat was one of wrestling's most technically gifted athletes, whose picture-perfect drop kicks and flawless execution made him the standard by which all wrestlers were measured. He delivered legendary matches that drew millions, while making promoters rich beyond their wildest dreams. But when Steamboat refused controversial storylines and dared to put his family before the business, WWE blacklisted him and made sure he would never reach the top. What happened to Ricky reveals the cutthroat machine that destroys anyone who won't sell their soul to corporate greed. But his story starts long before these corporate battles, with a man who never even planned to become a wrestler. Richard Henry Blood was born in West Point, New York on February 20th, 1953, into a military family that would take him around the world. His father's service in the U.S. military meant constant movement from base to base, exposing Richard to different cultures and ways of life that most future wrestlers never experienced. He died firefighting before fate intervened, having no childhood dreams of becoming a professional wrestler, while other future stars were already fantasizing about championship gold. Richard's athletic talents emerged in high school, where he became a Florida state champion in amateur wrestling. This wasn't part of some grand plan to become a wrestling superstar. It was just a kid who happened to be naturally gifted at sports. His amateur wrestling success gave him a foundation that would later prove invaluable, teaching him real wrestling techniques and building the kind of athletic ability that would set him apart from his peers. The wrestling business found Richard through his girlfriend's connection to the industry. She knew someone who knew someone, and before long, Richard was hearing about opportunities in professional wrestling. This accidental entry into the business was completely different from wrestlers who grew up watching matches and dreaming of fame. Richard approached wrestling as an outsider, without the emotional baggage or unrealistic expectations that often came with childhood dreams of wrestling stardom. When Richard decided to pursue professional wrestling, he headed to Minnesota to train under Vern Gagne. Gagne's training camp was legendary for its brutality. It wasn't just about learning wrestling moves, it was about breaking down hopefuls and rebuilding them from scratch. Most people who showed up at Gagne's camp never made it through the training. The physical demands were extreme, the mental pressure was constant, and Gagne had no patience for anyone who wasn't completely committed. Richard's experience at the training camp was a shock to his system. He lost 40 pounds during the training process, showing just how intense the program was. His body was pushed to its absolute limits as he learned the fundamentals of professional wrestling. The weight loss wasn't just from exercise, it was from the stress, the physical punishment, and the complete transformation required to become a professional wrestler. Many trainees couldn't handle the pressure and quit, but Richard's military background and natural toughness helped him survive. The diverse background Richard brought to wrestling gave him a unique perspective that other wrestlers lacked. He had seen the world, experienced different cultures, and approached wrestling as a business rather than a childhood fantasy. This outsider's view would later become both his greatest strength and his biggest weakness. His worldly perspective helped him develop a more sophisticated approach to wrestling, but it also put him at odds with the traditional wrestling mentality that valued loyalty and compliance over independent thinking. Richard's late start in wrestling meant he approached the business differently than wrestlers who had been dreaming of it their whole lives. He wasn't willing to sacrifice everything for wrestling success because he had other life experiences to draw from. This balanced perspective would later cause problems with promoters who expected total devotion to the wrestling business. His military family background taught him about discipline and respect, but it also gave him a strong sense of personal values that wouldn't bend easily to wrestling's demands. The fact that Richard stumbled into wrestling almost by accident created a wrestler who was technically excellent, but politically naive. His amateur wrestling background gave him legitimate athletic credentials that most wrestlers couldn't match. His diverse upbringing made him more well-rounded as a person than many of his peers. However, his lack of childhood wrestling dreams meant he never fully understood the unwritten rules of wrestling politics. Richard Henry Blood's unconventional entry into wrestling created both his greatest strengths and his biggest weaknesses in dealing with promoters. His journey from military brat to wrestling prodigy technology was just beginning, and the real education was about to start when he entered the territorial system. What happened once he headed to Florida's wrestling scene would teach him lessons that Vernagong's brutal training camp never could. Florida's wrestling scene introduced Richard to a world where identity was just another marketing tool. Eddie Graham, the powerful promoter running championship wrestling from Florida, looked at this young athlete and saw potential. He also saw an opportunity to create a story that would sell tickets. Graham decided that Richard would become the nephew of Sammy Steamboat, a wrestler who had enjoyed success in Florida and was still remembered by older fans. This fabricated family connection was designed to give the new wrestler instant credibility and name recognition with fans who might remember Sammy from years before. The transformation from Rick Blood to Ricky Steamboat happened without any input from the man himself. Promoters controlled every aspect of a wrestler's identity in the territorial system, and Richard had no say in becoming Steamboat. Graham saw value in an Asian-flavored persona in Florida's market, capitalizing on the martial arts movie craze that was sweeping through popular culture. This was his first lesson in how wrestling promoters operated. Your real identity didn't matter as much as what they could sell to the audience. The territorial system was a harsh environment that chewed up wrestlers and spit them out. Wrestlers traveled constantly, driving hundreds of miles between small towns for shows that might draw 50 people or 500. The pay was low and unpredictable. Promoters promised certain amounts, but often paid less when ticket sales were disappointing. Wrestlers had to cover their own travel expenses, hotel rooms, and meals while making very little money. The schedule was brutal. Wrestlers might work every night of the week, sometimes twice on weekends, with no guaranteed days off. In Florida and Georgia, Steamboat began developing the smooth technical style that would become his trademark. Unlike many wrestlers who relied on brawling or power moves, Steamboat focused on crisp technical wrestling combined with impressive athletic ability. He studied martial arts films and incorporated moves that looked spectacular but were relatively safe to perform. His background in legitimate amateur wrestling gave him a foundation that many professional wrestlers lacked. He could execute complex holds and transitions that looked effortless but required years of practice to master. The Kung Fu movie craze of the 1970s gave Steamboat an opportunity to stand out from typical wrestlers. Bruce Lee films and other martial arts movies were incredibly popular, and Steamboat incorporated elements from these films into his wrestling style. He developed a martial arts-inspired moveset that included high-flying moves, precise strikes, and dramatic poses that looked like they came straight from a kung fu film. His signature dragon suplex and flying crossbody became crowd favorites because they looked both dangerous and beautiful when executed properly. Steamboat's partnership with Jay Youngblood represented something rare in professional wrestling, a genuine friendship. Most wrestling relationships were manufactured for business purposes, but Steamboat and Youngblood developed a real bond that extended beyond the ring. They traveled together, supported each other through the challenges of the wrestling business, and became inseparable behind the scenes. Their authentic friendship translated into incredible chemistry as a tag team, and fans could sense that their connection was real. This authenticity made them hugely popular with audiences who were tired of obviously fake relationships between wrestlers. Early signs of Steamboat's principled nature began clashing with promoter expectations and business demands. Unlike many wrestlers who would do anything promoters asked, Steamboat had personal boundaries that he wasn't willing to cross. He refused to participate in storylines that went against his values or portrayed him in ways that made him uncomfortable. This principled stance impressed other wrestlers but frustrated promoters who expected complete compliance. His unwillingness to compromise his values for business success marked him as different from other wrestlers who would agree to any storyline if it meant more money or better positioning. Steamboat's territorial success came at the cost of learning to navigate wrestling politics, a skill he never fully mastered. He focused on improving his in-ring performance and connecting with audiences, but he never learned how to play the backstage games that were essential for long-term success. While other wrestlers were building relationships with bookers and promoters, Steamboat was perfecting his craft. His technical excellence and fan popularity should have been enough, but wrestling success required political skills that he didn't possess. His move to Jim Crockett Promotions would bring bigger opportunities and bigger challenges, where his abilities would be tested by someone who immediately recognized his potential. Ric Flair saw Steamboat's potential immediately, but their legendary rivalry almost ended Steamboat's career before it truly began. When Steamboat arrived at Jim Crockett Promotions in 1977, he walked into a completely different world than the smaller territorial promotions he was used to. JCP was big business, with television deals, major arenas, and established stars who had been working together for years. This wasn't just about having good matches anymore. It was about fitting into a complex system where personal relationships and backstage maneuvering mattered as much as what happened in the ring. Ric Flair was already the top star when Steamboat showed up, and he immediately recognized something special in the newcomer. Flair said, "Here's a guy that's handsome with a great body, a nice guy, and Ricky Steamboat could wrestle from day one." This endorsement from the company's biggest star opened doors for Steamboat that might have taken years to open otherwise. Flair's support meant better matches, more television time, and opportunities to work with other top wrestlers. The brutal reality of their early matches showed just how dangerous wrestling could be when wrestlers pushed the limits. Flair and Steamboat developed a chemistry that was electric, but it came at a physical cost. In one particularly intense match, Flair rubbed Steamboat's face against the concrete floor outside the ring in a spot that could have caused permanent damage. The concrete was rough and unforgiving, and the friction could have torn skin off Steamboat's face or caused serious injuries to his eyes. This wasn't just about making the match look realistic. It was about two wrestlers who trusted each other enough to do incredibly dangerous things to create unforgettable moments. The contrasting personalities between Flair and Steamboat made their rivalry even more compelling for audiences. Flair lived the extravagant lifestyle that matched his nature boy character: expensive suits, luxury cars, and a lifestyle that screamed excess. He partied hard, spent money freely, and made sure everyone knew he was living the high life. Steamboat was the complete opposite. He focused on his family, lived modestly, and approached wrestling as a job rather than a lifestyle. He went home to his wife and kids instead of hitting the bars with other wrestlers. This difference wasn't just about their characters, it was about who they really were as people. Their chemistry in the ring generated massive revenue for Crockett Promotions, but it also created unrealistic expectations for Steamboat's character. Fans loved watching the humble, hard-working Steamboat battle the arrogant, wealthy Flair. The matches drew huge crowds and sold tons of tickets, proving that their rivalry was money in the bank for the promotion. However, this success trapped Steamboat in a specific role. Promoters expected him to always be the good guy, the family man, the wrestler who did things the right way. Any attempt to change his character or try something different was met with resistance because the Flair feud had established what fans expected from Steamboat. Steamboat's NWA Television Championship win in North Carolina established him as a legitimate main event talent in the eyes of fans and other wrestlers. The Television Championship was an important title in JCP because it was defended regularly on television, giving the champion consistent exposure and credibility. Steamboat's reign proved he could carry a championship and be a featured performer week after week. His matches were consistently good, and he drew positive reactions from crowds throughout the territory. The success in the Carolinas was preparing Steamboat for bigger stages, but it was also setting him up for political challenges that would make JCP look simple. His reputation as a great wrestler was growing, and bigger promotions were starting to notice. The Flair rivalry taught Steamboat that great matches weren't enough. You also had to play the backstage game. However, his focus on wrestling excellence rather than backstage politics meant he wasn't developing the skills he would need to navigate more complex corporate environments. His next opportunity would test every lesson he thought he'd learned about the wrestling business. Steamboat's WWF debut was everything he dreamed of, but Vince McMahon's corporate machine was about to teach him a harsh lesson about loyalty. When Steamboat arrived in the WWF in 1986, he walked into a completely different world than the territorial promotions he was used to. This wasn't just a bigger wrestling company. It was a corporate entertainment machine that controlled every aspect of its performers' lives. The WWF had strict rules about character consistency and demanded absolute availability from wrestlers. Everything was designed to protect the company's image and maximize profits. The timing of Steamboat's arrival couldn't have been better for creating his dragon character. Martial arts movies were huge in the 1980s, and the WWF was always looking for ways to capitalize on popular trends. They saw Steamboat's martial arts-inspired moveset and immediately recognized the marketing potential. The company created elaborate entrance music, colorful costumes, and promotional materials that played up the dragon persona. Steamboat's natural athletic ability and smooth wrestling style fit perfectly with what audiences expected from a martial arts-inspired character. The pressure of the WWF's corporate structure was unlike anything Steamboat had experienced in his career. The company demanded absolute loyalty from its wrestlers. This meant being available for television tapings, house shows, and promotional appearances whenever the company needed you. Wrestlers were expected to stay in character at all times, even when they weren't performing. The WWF made it clear that the company's needs came before any personal considerations. Steamboat's feud with Jake Roberts showed just how dangerous the WWF's approach to wrestling could be. The matches between Steamboat and Roberts were brutal affairs that often resulted in legitimate injuries. Roberts was known for his psychological warfare and willingness to push boundaries, but the WWF encouraged this kind of intensity because it made for compelling television. Steamboat suffered real injuries from dangerous spots that were designed to look spectacular rather than be safe. The company's attitude was that injuries were part of the business, and wrestlers were expected to work through pain to maintain their spot on the roster. The WrestleMania III match against Randy Savage was the perfect example of how the WWF manufactured classic matches. Steamboat and Savage planned their match move for move, practicing dozens of different spots to create maximum drama and excitement. The company's production team worked with both wrestlers to design a match that would tell a compelling story and showcase both performers' abilities. The match went exactly as planned, with Steamboat winning the Intercontinental Championship in what many consider one of the greatest matches in wrestling history. However, this success came with a price that Steamboat didn't fully understand at the time. Winning the Intercontinental Championship seemed like validation of everything Steamboat had worked for in his career. The title was often called the Workers' Championship because it was typically given to wrestlers who were respected for their in-ring ability. Steamboat's reign proved that he belonged at the top level of the wrestling business. However, becoming champion also put him under more corporate scrutiny than ever before. The WWF expected their champions to be available for more promotional work, more television appearances, and more demanding travel schedules. The title came with responsibilities that extended far beyond what happened in the ring. The mounting pressure between Steamboat's wrestling success and his personal values created a conflict that was becoming impossible to ignore. His family commitments were important to him, but the WWF's schedule made it difficult to spend time at home. The company expected wrestlers to prioritize the business above everything else, including their families. Steamboat watched other wrestlers sacrifice their personal relationships for wrestling success, and he wasn't sure he wanted to make the same choice. His values told him that family should come first, but the wrestling business demanded total commitment. Steamboat's WWF success was built on a foundation that required sacrificing everything else, a price he wasn't willing to pay. The company's demands were relentless, and there was no room for compromise when it came to loyalty and availability. Other wrestlers had learned to accept this reality, but Steamboat's background and values made it impossible for him to completely surrender his personal life to the wrestling business. The disciplined corporate environment that had made him a champion was about to test his priorities in ways he never expected. When Steamboat's son was born in March 1987, he made a request that seemed reasonable, but to Vince McMahon, it was an act of betrayal that would destroy his career. Right after his WrestleMania III Triumph, Steamboat's wife Bonnie was pregnant with their first child, Richard Jr. For most people, this would be a joyous time when family takes priority over everything else. Steamboat approached McMahon with what he thought was a simple request. He wanted time off to be with his wife for the birth of their son. This wasn't asking for months away from wrestling or demanding special treatment. He just wanted to be there for one of the most important moments in his life as a husband and father. McMahon's reaction was swift and brutal. On June 13, 1987, Steamboat lost the Intercontinental Championship to Honky Tonk Man as punishment for prioritizing family over business. The decision shocked Steamboat and everyone else in the company. Here was a wrestler who had just delivered one of the greatest matches in WrestleMania history, a performer who was over with the crowd and drawing money for the company. Yet McMahon saw his request for family time as a direct challenge to the WWF's authority and an unacceptable disruption to business operations. The decision to give the title to Honky Tonk Man was a deliberate message to the entire roster about loyalty expectations. McMahon could have chosen any wrestler to take the championship from Steamboat, but he specifically selected Honky Tonk Man, a performer who was nowhere near Steamboat's level of talent or fan popularity. This wasn't about finding the best wrestler for the championship. It was about sending a clear signal that loyalty to the company mattered more than talent, fan support, or drawing power. Every wrestler in the locker room understood what this meant. Cross McMahon's corporate demands, and your career would suffer regardless of your abilities. His reputation as the consummate babyface became a creative prison that limited his options in an evolving wrestling landscape. Wrestling was changing in the late 1980s, with more complex characters and storylines becoming popular. Steamboat was locked into the role of the good guy who always did the right thing, but this character type was becoming less relevant in a business that was moving toward more edgy and controversial content. His wholesome family man image, which had been an asset, now made him seem outdated compared to wrestlers who were willing to push boundaries and take creative risks. The systematic burial of Steamboat's character began almost immediately after his request for family time. His main event matches became less frequent, replaced by mid-card feuds that didn't showcase his abilities or draw significant fan interest. The storylines he was given became weaker and less compelling, making it harder for him to connect with audiences. His television time was reduced, limiting his exposure and making it difficult to maintain his fan base. These changes weren't accidental. They were a deliberate strategy to diminish his importance within the company. Other wrestlers watched what happened to Steamboat and learned that crossing McMahon had severe consequences. The locker room saw how quickly a top performer could be demoted for putting personal considerations ahead of company demands. This created a culture of fear, where wrestlers were afraid to ask for time off, request changes to their characters, or challenge creative decisions. The message was clear. Your value to the company was conditional on your willingness to sacrifice everything else for wrestling success. Steamboat's attempts to return to his previous position after his son's birth were met with continued resistance from management. When he came back at the Survivor Series in November 1987, he was included in the WrestleMania IV tournament for the vacant WWF Championship, but his push was significantly curtailed. The decisive moment came when he lost to Greg Valentine in the first round of the tournament, effectively ending any hope of returning to main event status. McMahon's lingering resentment over Steamboat's sabbatical affected every decision about his character and storylines. His frustrations with his new position and the WWF's creative direction eventually led him to seek opportunities elsewhere. Steamboat was disgruntled with his role on the card and the lack of meaningful feuds being offered to him. He realized that his relationship with McMahon had been permanently damaged by his request for family time, and there was no path back to his previous status within the company. His departure from the WWF in 1988 seemed like the end of his main event career, but another opportunity was waiting that would prove wrestling success was still possible for someone who refused to compromise his values. On January 21, 1989, Steamboat signed with WCW as their first major acquisition from the WWF, making a statement that they were serious about competing with Vince McMahon's empire. This wasn't just about getting another wrestler on the roster. WCW wanted established stars who could bring credibility to their company and attract fans who might not have been watching WCW programming. Steamboat's arrival signaled a shift in how WCW approached talent acquisition and showed they were willing to invest in proven performers. WCW initially treated Steamboat as a valued star, giving him the world title and main event matches that showcased his abilities. The company understood what they had in Steamboat and didn't waste time putting him in meaningless feuds or mid-card storylines. They gave him an immediate championship opportunity against Ric Flair, the company's biggest star and most reliable performer. This wasn't a gradual build-up or a test to see if Steamboat could handle the pressure. WCW was confident enough in his abilities to put him directly into their main event scene. The legendary trilogy of matches with Flair elevated both wrestlers and the company to new heights. Their February 20th, 1989 match at Chi-Town Rumble was a wrestling showcase that demonstrated what professional wrestling could be when two masters of the craft worked together. The match told a complete story in the ring, with both men pushing each other to their limits and creating moments that fans still talk about today. Steamboat's victory was a great moment in WCW history and pro wrestling as a whole, proving that he belonged in the main event picture. The second match of their trilogy was a 2 out of 3 falls match at Clash of the Champions 6 on April 2nd in New Orleans. Many consider this the best of the 3 matches because of the incredible conditioning both men displayed and the dramatic finish that added to the feud. Both wrestlers scored pinfalls during the match, taking the audience on an emotional journey that showcased why they were considered the best wrestlers of that era. The match went down to the wire, with both men giving everything they had to win. These matches represented the peak of wrestling as sport before the shift to sports entertainment. Jim Cornette stated that the Flair vs. Steamboat trilogy was the peak of an entertaining sport versus sports entertainment. Their matches focused on athletic competition and storytelling through wrestling moves rather than elaborate storylines or entertainment segments. This was pure wrestling at its finest, with both men relying on their technical skills and ring psychology to create compelling television. Steamboat's NWA title reign from February to May 1989 was impactful because he brought a new style of athletic wrestling to the championship. His matches with Flair were highly entertaining, and even though he held the title for just 3 months, he had some of the best NWA title matches in the history of the belt. This reign solidified his status as a top-tier performer and proved that WCW valued his contributions more than the WWF ever did. The company gave him the platform to showcase his abilities at the highest level. The gradual changes in WCW's corporate culture became apparent as new management took over and priorities shifted. After dropping the title back to Flair, Steamboat found himself without a clear direction in the company. No subsequent storyline matched the drama of his rivalry with Flair, highlighting the challenges Steamboat faced in navigating wrestling politics. The company seemed unsure of how to use him effectively outside of his legendary feud. Steamboat's departure from WCW later in 1989 was due to a contract dispute that the company couldn't resolve. The NWA and WCW style of wrestling really helped Ricky Steamboat, but they just couldn't come to terms on a new contract. This situation showed the business side of wrestling and how contract negotiations could end promising runs. His back injury in 1994 during a match with Steve Austin made him vulnerable to corporate politics once again. The injury occurred during a rematch at Clash of the Champions 20 when Steamboat took a bad bump from the top turnbuckle. This injury forced him to relinquish the United States Championship and put him out of action. Being injured in professional wrestling meant you were no longer generating revenue for the company, making you expendable regardless of your past contributions. The shocking FedEx firing while Steamboat was still recovering from his back injury showed how disposable even legends were to wrestling corporations. Eric Bischoff fired him via a FedEx package, which was a cost-cutting measure that reflected the changing landscape of wrestling. This incident exposed the wrestling industry's true nature and showed how even respected veterans could be discarded when they were no longer useful to the company's bottom line. The betrayal cut deeper than any corporate punishment he had faced before, proving that talent and legacy meant nothing when profits were at stake. Wrestling history would remember Steamboat differently if he had been willing to compromise his principles for corporate success. When you look at Steamboat's career, it becomes clear that his trajectory was shaped more by backstage politics than his incredible in-ring performance. He was universally respected by his peers as one of the greatest technical wrestlers of all time, yet his career never reached the heights that his talent deserved. The reason wasn't his ability to wrestle or connect with fans. It was his unwillingness to compromise his personal values for corporate success. Compare Steamboat's treatment to wrestlers who played the political game better, despite having less talent or drawing power. While Steamboat was getting buried for requesting family time, other wrestlers who knew how to navigate backstage politics were getting pushed to the moon. Take Honky Tonk Man, who held the Intercontinental Championship for over a year, despite being nowhere near Steamboat's level of in-ring ability. These wrestlers might not have had Steamboat's technical skills or natural charisma, but they understood what promoters wanted to hear. They said yes to every creative direction, never questioned storylines, and made themselves completely available to the company's demands. This compliance was rewarded with better positions on the card, more television time, and opportunities that Steamboat never got. Steamboat's principled stands were systematically punished by promoters who valued compliance over ability. He didn't want to compromise his character or values, even if it would have helped his career. Most wrestlers would have jumped at the chance to try different characters if it meant more money and better storylines. But Steamboat's integrity wouldn't allow him to portray something that made him uncomfortable, even if it would have advanced his position in the company. His later WWE returns showed how past conflicts limited his opportunities even as a legend. When Steamboat came back to WWE, for special appearances and his Hall of Fame induction, he was treated respectfully but never given the spotlight that his contributions deserved. The company remembered his past conflicts with McMahon and made sure to keep his role limited. Other wrestlers from his era who had maintained better relationships with management got more prominent roles and better treatment during their return appearances. Steamboat's past conflicts followed him even decades later. The reputation for being difficult followed Steamboat throughout his career, despite being universally respected by peers. This perception came from his unwillingness to compromise his values and his tendency to speak up when he felt wrestlers were being mistreated. In the wrestling business, standing up for principles was often seen as being difficult to work with. Promoters wanted wrestlers who would agree to anything without question. Steamboat's willingness to push back on creative decisions or contract terms earned him a reputation that hurt his career opportunities. The long-term impact on Steamboat's legacy is evident in how many casual fans might recognize names like Hulk Hogan or the Ultimate Warrior before mentioning Steamboat when discussing the greatest wrestlers of the 1980s. Many of these wrestlers couldn't match Steamboat's in-ring ability, but they understood how to work within the system. They knew how to stay in management's good graces and position themselves for success. Steamboat's focus on wrestling excellence rather than political maneuvering meant he never got the recognition he deserved from mainstream audiences. Steamboat's story represents a broader pattern in wrestling's treatment of principled performers. The wrestling industry has always rewarded compliance and adaptability more than talent and integrity. Wrestlers who were willing to sacrifice their personal values for corporate success often found themselves in better positions than those who maintained their principles. This pattern continues today, where wrestlers who are seen as good for business get opportunities regardless of their talent level, while more skilled wrestlers who don't fit the corporate mold get overlooked. Jim Cornette observed that the Flair vs. Steamboat trilogy represented the peak of an entertaining sport versus sports entertainment. This comment highlights how Steamboat's commitment to in-ring excellence was becoming outdated in an industry that increasingly valued spectacle over athletic competition. His approach to wrestling, while celebrated by purists, was less commercially viable as the business evolved toward entertainment rather than sport. Modern wrestlers like CM Punk have acknowledged Steamboat's influence on their careers, emphasizing his commitment to in-ring excellence and his ability to connect with audiences. This influence proves that Steamboat's legacy extends beyond championships or main event positions. His dedication to his craft continues to resonate with wrestlers who followed in his footsteps, showing that some victories can't be measured in titles or corporate approval. The wrestling business taught Steamboat that talent and integrity could endure the corporate machine, even when they couldn't fully overcome it. He showed that a wrestler could maintain his values and still earn respect from fans and peers worldwide. Think about the wrestlers you admire most. They might be fighting battles you never see behind the scenes. True legends are often made by what they refuse to do, not what they accomplish. His 2009 Hall of Fame induction finally gave him the recognition he deserved, proving that history remembers character as much as championships. Next up, Mr. Perfect. Mr. Perfect is the greatest technical wrestler to ever step in the ring. He captured championships in every major territory, mastered moves no one else could execute, and even became wrestling's first true perfectionist who could excel at any sport he touched. But in 2003, one decision would change everything. And it didn't just end Mr. Perfect's career, it tragically ended his life. In 1958, Curt Hennig was born in Robbinsdale, Minnesota. He was the son of Larry the Axe Hennig, one of the most respected wrestlers in the business, soaking up knowledge that would serve him well in the years to come. Wrestling wasn't just something he watched on TV, it was his family's way of life. Growing up, Curt showed early signs that he was something special. In high school, he could do it all. Football teams wanted him, basketball coaches tried to recruit him, and he made everything look easy. But despite all these offers coming his way, Curt knew exactly what he wanted to do with his life. Just like his father before him, the wrestling ring was calling his name. When Curt started training with wrestling legend Verne Gagne, something became clear right away. Curt was a natural in the ring. While most new wrestlers needed months of practice, Curt picked everything up instantly, like he'd been doing it his whole life. Starting out in the AWA in 1980, Curt felt a lot of pressure on his shoulders. Everyone kept comparing him to his dad, Larry the Axe Hennig, one of the toughest wrestlers around. For a young guy just starting out, those were some big boots to fill. That's why in 1981, Curt jumped at the chance to work for Vince McMahon's World Wrestling Federation. The run didn't last long though, as his wife was about to have their first baby. But in that short time, he caught McMahon's eye as someone special. Going back to the AWA turned out to be a smart move. Curt teamed up with a young Scott Hall, and together, they won the tag team titles. They would end up being one of the last great teams in AWA history. But it was when Curt started wrestling on his own that things really took off. In 1987, he hit the biggest moment of his career so far, beating the legendary Nick Bockwinkel to become AWA World Champion. This was huge not just for Curt, but for the whole Hennig family, as even his dad Curt had finally stepped out of his father's shadow. He held that title for over a year, but by the late 1980s, the AWA was in trouble. The company that had been around for decades was starting to fall apart. Lucky for Curt, though, Vince McMahon hadn't forgotten about the talented young wrestler he'd seen years before. As the AWA was heading toward its end, McMahon came calling with an offer that would change everything. When Curt walked back into the WWF in 1988, Vince McMahon could hardly believe how much he'd grown. The young kid who'd briefly worked for him years before had turned into a complete performer. Everyone needed a character, something that would make them stand out from the crowd. That's how Mr. Perfect was born. Looking at Curt's background as a natural athlete who'd excelled at every sport he tried, McMahon knew they had something special on their hands. Yes, they filmed those now famous TV spots showing Mr. Perfect doing amazing things in different sports. Sinking impossible basketball shots, throwing perfect spirals in football, and even bowling perfect games. While some of these needed a few takes to get right, Curt's natural ability meant he could actually do most of these feats himself. Even when he wasn't the one doing the talking, Curt found ways to steal the show. While Flair was cutting one of his famous promos, fans couldn't help but watch Perfect in the background, making faces and reactions that made everything even better. During their time working together, Kurt and Rick became close friends, which wasn't surprising given Kurt's personality. Behind the scenes, Kurt was known as one of the most well-liked guys in the locker room. He was always ready with a joke or a prank to lighten the mood, the kind of person who could make everyone laugh even on their worst days. But while he kept everyone else smiling, Kurt was fighting his own battles. His back wasn't getting any better, and he'd started relying more and more on painkillers just to get through the day. Yes, even though he wasn't taking bumps in the ring anymore, the pain from his injuries just wouldn't go away. The 1992 Survivor Series was set to feature a huge tag team match, The Ultimate Warrior and Randy Savage against Ric Flair and Razor Ramon. But when Warrior suddenly quit the company right before the show, Vince McMahon found himself in a tight spot. After running through his options, each time ever he'd be playing a good guy. But just like everything else in his career, Kurt made it look easy. Fans who'd spent years hating him now found themselves cheering as he sent his old friend Ric Flair packing back to WCW in a loser leaves town match in January '93. After that, he had good feuds with rising stars like Shawn Michaels and Lex Luger. But something was different this time around. The sad truth was that Kurt just couldn't move like he used to, and both he and the fans could see it. By 1996, Vince McMahon was trying to get Mr. Perfect back in the ring one more time. The timing seemed odd, though. Kurt was about to get a $300,000 payout from his insurance deal, money he planned to use for retirement. Then, out of nowhere, Lloyd's of London refused to pay up. Kurt had his suspicions about this, thinking Vince might have pulled some strings to force him back to work. Yes, while no one ever proved if this was true or not, the whole thing left a bad taste in Kurt's mouth. Angry about the situation, Kurt reached out to Eric Bischoff over at WCW, coming to an abrupt end after what became known as the plane ride from hell. Yes, on a commercial flight back from the UK to the US, several wrestlers got out of hand, but Kurt's actions stood out even among the chaos. After having too much to drink, he got into a wrestling match with Brock Lesnar that ended up with both men crashing into the plane's emergency exit, the kind of thing that could have ended in tragedy. When the dust settled from that infamous flight, several wrestlers lost their jobs, and Kurt was among them. For the next few months, Kurt bounced around the independent wrestling scene. Showing up at CERN in 2002, Curt Hennig's story would come to a tragic end on February 10, 2003. He was supposed to wrestle at the Florida State Fair that day, part of his ongoing effort to climb back to the top of the business he loved. But at 10 p.m. in a moment that would shake the wrestling world, a hotel housekeeper made a devastating discovery: Kurt's body in his room. At just 44 years old, leaving behind a wife and 4 children who would now have to go on without their perfect dad.
I lost somebody that meant the world to me. He wasn't only my dad, he was like a brother. He was my hero.
When the Hillsborough County Medical Examiner's Office released their findings on March 26, 2003, the official cause was listed as acute cocaine intoxication. But like so many wrestling deaths of that era, the full story wasn't quite that simple. For Kurt's father, Larry "the Axe" Hennig, things just didn't add up. Speaking in the book The Pro Wrestling Hall of Fame, The Heels, Larry voiced the questions that haunted him. "It's not quite clear to me yet, and perhaps it never will be," he said. "From my standpoint, it just looked like it was one of those one-night deals. Got in with the wrong people." Unlike many veterans who kept their knowledge to themselves, Kurt believed in passing on what he'd learned. Yes, following the example set by Roddy Piper before him, he took countless younger wrestlers under his wing, including future star Brock Lesnar. As Sean Waltman would later recall, Kurt saw teaching others as his duty to the business. But maybe what people remember most about Kurt was his ability to light up any room he walked into. Stone cold. Steve Austin recalled never seeing Kurt in a bad mood, while others talked about how he could turn around the atmosphere in even the most miserable locker room. Today, his legacy lives on through his son Curtis Axel, who carries the Hennig name proudly in the ring. Before every match, Curtis quietly prays to his father. While his story may have ended too soon, his legacy lives on through the countless matches he left behind, the performers he influenced, and the memories he created for fans around the world.